time data. Okay, the YouTube stream should be up and running. So Wig, while I'm making sure that all the technical parts are all set, would you mind kicking us off officially?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everybody. This is the main monthly meeting of the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee. We also have two other meetings that people can join us in, but this is the main one each month. We have a marketing and operations meeting as well, and a capital and finance meeting as well. All of them on Tuesdays. Then we have a tiny agenda setting meeting, which isn't really lasts very long. Do you want to have public comments? You want us to introduce ourselves, Stefan? What do you suggest?
I think we should make the call out for public comment. I see two attendees that are not official members of the ROC. Barry is an honorary member and representative of APT. So between Barry and Mr. David Howe, I'm going to allow you to talk, David, and Barry already is able to talk. Either one of you would like to make a public comment to kick off our January 25th, 2022 meeting?
Just to tell you who I am, Barry Steinberg, Association for Public Transportation, and a longtime non-member of the TROC.
We call you honorary member, though. It's well justified.
Thank you. No other comments at this time.
Okay, cool. And there'll be another opportunity at the end of the meeting, as shown on our agenda, about 10 of 7.
Excuse me for a second.
And Mr. David Howe, no obligation, but would you like to put any comment on record at this time? Again, no obligation, and there'll be a chance again at the end of the meeting, just before 7. No problem at all. I'm going to... Oh, let me just make sure. Let me hit the ask to unmute. David, again, you don't have to say anything, but I just want to make sure you have every opportunity since I think you're joining us for the first time. Again, no obligation.
So, Stefan, should we do a brief introduction of members? Because Fred may not know everybody.
Oh, I think we should, yeah. Tell you what, Wig, why don't you kick things off, and I'll let you call on people in the order that you want. And again, I'm just making sure that all the technical nuts and bolts are all set.
Okay, so Fred knows me, which is a problem. But I'm a pretty long time member from Somerville. I'm happy to be here. Starting to focus more on regional transportation and less on Somerville as the Green Line winds up and the community path projects. So let me see. Len, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. I'm Leonard Diggins, and I live in East Arlington, and I pretty much use the Red Line every day, 5 days a week.
Thank you. And Craig, I'll let you introduce yourself. We don't want to steal your thunder.
Oh, that's quite all right. Hi, Craig Laskowski, a public member. I live in Milton.
And he's our high-speed line advocate.
Yeah, it's my job every meeting to ask at least one question about the Mattapan high-speed line.
And
okay.
Then, and Bradley, we get this great assistance from CTPS, which we appreciate. So Bradley, do you want to introduce yourself?
Bradley Putnam. I work in the Transit Analysis and Planning Group at CTPS. Fred actually helped me get me where I am today because I took his class at MIT in the fall of 2016. I was a graduate student at Tufts at the time. I got a master's in urban environmental policy and planning at Tufts, but they permitted me to take Fred's class, which I very much enjoyed. So thank you.
And we've got another member who's just joined us, Carl, who's a former member of the ROC. Carl, do you I think it's okay, Stefan, if we ask Carl if he wants to make any public statement.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I thought Carl was still an
I'm
active
sorry.
member. Yeah.
Oh, I'm screwing up. My apologies.
Carl, you want
Carl,
to say hi?
Hi. No public comments from me. Certainly very interested in hearing Secretary Salvucci's comments tonight.
great. Thank you, Carl. So, Stefan, how do you want to proceed with Fred?
Well, I think
I've got in my head kind of a history of large projects, and
Oh, I think that would be
Fred may
great. Oh, and I should mention also, real quick, I should introduce myself.
Yes,
Hi,
sorry.
Fred. I'm Stefan Wunsch. I'm in Lynn, and before the pandemic, an active writer of virtually every part of the system on a regular basis because of where I had to go for work. I'm the co-chair of the Full Rock and also the co-chair of the subcommittee for operations and communications and marketing. And like Len and Wig, the three of us have been on this committee, I think going back to, what was it, Len or Wig, 2005 or so, or 2004? So we're kind of longtime members. And again, thank you for joining us, Fred. Great pleasure to have you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So go ahead, Wig, I'll let you take it up because you and Fred know each other probably better than anyone, maybe other than Bradley. So I'll let you take us where you think we should
Yeah,
go.
sure. So, I just thought it might be a nice time to chat with Fred because we're kind of at an inflection point in how we look at the environment and energy, and that will certainly have some impacts on the projects that we do transit-wise going forward. And some of them may be big. I know Fred's got one favorite, the red-blue connector. But I thought it might make sense to start at the beginning, if that's okay, because Fred worked on the projects early in his career that came out of the Boston Transportation Plan Review and involved a really substantial upgrade and extensions of the core subway system. Does that make sense? Fred, do you want to make a few comments about that experience and then we'll walk forward?
Well, yeah, sure. So the Boston Transportation Planning Review was put in place by the first Secretary of Transportation of the Commonwealth, Alan Altshuler, who served in the administration of Governor Sargent. Alan was a professor of political science at MIT. He's now either fully retired or semi-retired at Harvard. But he had done a lot of research on transportation controversies. He wrote some interesting stuff about controversies in the Twin Cities where highways were being blasted through primarily Black neighborhoods to get suburbanites into the city, and a lot of conflict came out of that. And he was sort of an academic expert in urban transportation conflicts. And when Sargent became governor, sort of by accident, he was lieutenant governor. Then Governor Volpe was tapped by President Nixon to be U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Sargent became the governor of the state and was confronted with a significant amount of opposition to the construction of interstate highways into the middle of the city. The Unibelt that ran essentially through Central Square in Cambridge, the Route 2 extension that basically went from Alewife along the Fitchburg branch through Porter Square and into Somerville, the I-93, which unfortunately did get built, the I-95 coming up through Milton, proposed to come up through Milton or Dedham. There were two alignments through Hyde Park, Rosendale, Jamaica Plain, and the Third Harbor Tunnel, which was at the time proposed to be located literally in the Fort Point Channel and go into East Boston, cutting off the Jeffreys Point part of East Boston from the rest of East Boston, isolating Jeffreys Point to eventually, in the dreams of the airport, get bulldozed and become part of Logan Airport. So there were a lot of very destructive urban highway alignments, and opposition to those. I was one of the many people who volunteered to fight against these, starting in Cambridge against the Inner Belt, and then working together to build an urban-suburban coalition that included communities who were threatened directly, but also we got good support from the suburbs, from the League of Women Voters, from Milton, because of the Foul Meadow being threatened. And it was a unique coalition that there was multi-ethnic. There were Irish people and Italians and Blacks and Puerto Ricans and Yankees and academics and lots of people who didn't usually collaborate. In fact, the organization kind of changed its name from time to time. Probably the name that it retained for the longest period of time was the Greater Boston Committee on the Transportation Crisis. And it morphed into an organization I just heard a couple of minutes ago called the Association for Public Transportation, which is a descendant of the Anti-Highway Coalition. The glue that kept people together was really opposition to the highways because of their destructiveness. But because you needed, when someone said, well, you're against the highways, what are you for? You needed an answer to that question. So we'd say transit, because, and you know, the political reason for that was the transit didn't threaten anybody. It's, you know, skinny, doesn't damage a lot of housing, and you might even use it once in a while. So transit was not the burning issue that brought people together. Destruction of neighborhoods and loss of housing and businesses was what got people, you know, organized and angry and putting lots of time into pressure for change. But transit was sort of a secondary issue that people all supported to some degree. It was actually a more major part of the motivation of some of the suburbanites. A lot of the commuter rail riders and the commuter rail towns became allies of the urban neighborhoods because they did not want to lose their commuter rail service. And the highways in many ways threatened to knock out key links of the commuter rail. So transit was a kind of very important issue, but a secondary issue initiatively. Sargent tapped Altshuler in his academic role to lead a review of, he declared a moratorium on further highway construction while they took another look at it. And Altshuler was the head of a committee that was the usual doctor, lawyer, you know, one of these, one of those kind of task forces, someone from the business community, someone from labor. To take a look at this question, Altshuler recommended that there was no real rationale for building all of these highways, that there were a lot of important issues, and there ought to be a serious restudy of the whole thing. And Governor Sargent accepted the recommendation. He then taps Altshuler to be the first Secretary of Transportation. They spent about 6 months putting together the study design for the Boston Transportation Planning Review. Allen recruited a deputy, Jack Wofford, who I think some of you know. He's still active in Cambridgeport. And Jack, as Allen became more and more absorbed by all of the myriad duties of Secretary of Transportation, Jack more and more led the effort to get the study design done and then launch the Boston Transportation Planning Review. There were several things that were very, very unique about the way Al Schuler put that together. And the Inner-Belt Highway was canceled 50 years ago between Christmas and New Year's. So it's just over 50 years since the Inner-Belt was canceled. The decision to cancel the I-95 section through Milton, Dedham, Hyde Park, et cetera, came later in the year. So it will be 50 years in November from the full set of decisions that Sargent made. But the really unique thing about the Boston Transportation Planning Review was that for the first time, there would be direct participation in the management of the study by citizens. So in addition to there were still public agencies involved, but in addition to the MBTA and the Highway Department, which was then called the Department of Public Works, there were citizen groups, advocates from the communities who were threatened, environmentalists, the business community, the Chamber of Commerce had a representative, labor was represented. And every Thursday, there would be a meeting to discuss the progression of the studies. And that committee that was composed of representatives of all of these interests would weigh in on whether things were going right or not. So it's an unprecedented amount of transparency, which is the word we use today. The prior planning had all been backroom. You could not even get a base map from the State Department of Public Works of where they were planning to build these highways to figure out if your house was going to be taken or not. It was totally outrageous. The city of Boston planning department spent months trying to get maps, just basic information. Would you please tell us, since you're about to ruin our city, where you're going to do this? No, none of your business. They're ours. So what Altshuler did was really amazing in terms of opening up the process, in terms of allowing direct participation. He also had a component that they called Study Element 2, whose job was recognizing that there's a tyranny of the majority potential always in these things. If any of the groups felt aggrieved that some planning issue that they felt strongly about was not getting adequate attention, they could go to Study Element 2, which was 10% of the budget. And a fellow named Alan Sloan was in charge of it. And they would put a planner or an urban designer or an engineer or whatever was required to take a look at the issue that was being brought to Study Element 2 to put enough technical detail to give it a fair shot at being discussed. And this is like unprecedented stuff. I think it was the best planning study ever done in transportation since before or after. I mean, Altshuler really was really a genius in the way he put this thing together. I personally started out working for the city of Boston in the planning department, the Boston Redevelopment Authority. I was in an odd position because the city at the time supported the highways and I opposed them. So I was working every night as a volunteer fighting things that the agency I worked for supported. I sent a memo to my boss saying, look, I'm not a sneaky person. You should know what I'm doing at night. If it embarrasses you, I'll leave, but I feel strongly about this. And he let me stay, which was nice. It was good to have a day job. So my role in fighting the highways and eventually promoting transit started out really as a volunteer working with other volunteers, some of us technical, some of us more community grassroots people, building this coalition. and fighting essentially all of the plans that the highway department had, and some that the transit agency had. When Kevin White got elected mayor, replacing Mayor Collins, the city policy changed. And so I was able, he started a program called Little City Halls. I was the manager of the East Boston Little City Hall, one of the communities that was threatened by some of the highways. So I got to be able to work during the day as well as during the night in working with the coalition, fighting against the highways and for change, and also fighting for change in the nasty behavior of the Port Authority that was pretty brutal in East Boston, and many other communities. So that process that Alan Altshuler set up and Jack Wofford was one that I observed as a kind of citizen advocate, and then as the City of Boston designee, working, and many of the citizen volunteers that have been fighting the highways also got themselves designated. So that Tunny Lee, God rest his soul, who passed away a little while ago, an academic from MIT, who had been very involved in the grassroots effort. He represented the city of Cambridge, so he was at the task force meeting. So there were lots of people that some of you know: Ken Krookemeyer, Tony Pangaro, fellow became city councilor, Chuck Turner was an important, but there was a delightful lady named Elizabeth Houghton, Yankee lady. I suppose she's related to the Houghtons that the pond is named after, who came into the issue because of the highway threatening the foul meadow. I used to call her Madame Defy. She'd come to the meeting. She was always either knitting or crocheting. And I felt she was recording in her knitting what was going on in the meetings. And she'd be very quiet and she'd listen to this. And every once in a while, she'd say, and we were plotting and scheming, how do we get the attention of the governor? How do we, get the attention of various people? And then she'd say, well, I'll just call Elliot and ask him to call Francis. That would be Elliot Richardson. Ask him to call Francis. That would be Frank Sargent, the governor, and see if we can't put a stop to this nonsense. So Elizabeth was amazingly nice person, fun, and those connections helped. We also had tremendous help from a reporter at the Boston Globe named Alan Lupo, who for the first time, the Globe had always reflexively covered the point of view of the highway department. And for the first time, Lupo started covering it from the neighborhood point of view. And eventually Tom Winship, the editor of the Globe, became, in the end, became an advocate of the program those of us were arguing for, which was to stop the highways, shift most of the resources into public transportation. The only highways that survived and actually were quite a bit strengthened by the Boston Transportation Planning Review were the construction of putting the Central Artery below ground. It was called the depressed Central Artery in those days, and building a new airport tunnel, now called the Ted Williams Tunnel. But the difference of those two highways was that they were intended to enhance the city rather than undermine it, so that the Ted Williams Tunnel, rather than going through the middle of East Boston and isolating Jeffreys Point, goes directly over to Logan and in a sense isolates the airport and protects the neighborhood almost from further encroachment. So the location of that highway was dramatically different than the earlier one, and putting the Central Artery underground so that it could be, you could remove the ugly scar and replace it with the Kennedy Greenway. The decision on how to cover it was a decision that came out of a later process, but it eventually became mostly Kennedy Greenway. Those two highway links were the only significant highways that came out of the Boston Transportation Plan Review. The primary transit links were the extension of the Red Line beyond Harvard Square out to Porter, Davis, and Alewife, and in the other direction down to Braintree, and the relocation of the Orange Line into its current location in the Southwest Corridor from what had been the L between Forest Hills and downtown. There was a third major priority, which was the extension of the Blue Line up to Lynn, which was a major part of the set of decisions that came out of it. But I can describe later what happened to the Blue Line. The other transit priority, besides those three big ones that involved a lot of physical construction, was the upgrading and refurbishing of the commuter rail system, which ended up with, at the time, all new rolling stock, lots of new stations, some slight new rights of way, but generally rescuing the commuter rail system was about to fall apart. So you can look at those issues technically, but you can also look at them politically. Each component of that related to the priorities of parts of the coalition. So that the Southwest Corridor, for example, was in part a transit line that provides service to important destinations like Northeastern, Prudential, the John Hancock area, Tufts New England Medical Center. So you can view it as a transit service, but it was also a way to deal with the mess that the highway builders had left. They had destroyed a lot of housing and a lot of jobs. And one of the big questions on Frank Sargent's mind was, oh my God, 15 years from now, if this is still a wasteland, it's going to be Sargent's folly. What's the positive program? What's going to take the place of this highway that I'm stopping? And obviously the Jamaica Plain advocates and the Roxbury and South End advocates had a huge stake in having that become a nice place to replace the threat that had been there. So you can view it as a set of technical solutions from a transit point of view, or you can view them as urban design initiatives to upgrade rather than degrade the communities, or you can view it as a political strategy for the various components. For example, the primary push from Chuck Turner and the major Black activists who were involved from Roxbury was to participate in the construction jobs that would result from whatever came out of it. Roxbury, because of the collaboration of the city of Boston with the state, Boston had helped knock down the housing and the jobs in Roxbury to clear the path for the highways. So the losing housing and losing jobs had already happened. And, there was no fight. You couldn't undo the damage that had been done. So the primary demand was to add insult to injury. When you walk onto a construction jobs in those days, every worker is either Irish or Italian. No Black people, no Hispanics, no females. So the real push out of Roxbury was to get a sharing of the construction jobs. Alan Altshuler designed an affirmative action program in transportation that was upheld and cited all the way to the Supreme Court as a legally correct way to deal with affirmative action because it was rooted in past discrimination. There's a lot of current advocacy thinks that this is just a game of, this is what I want, you got to give it to me. You do that, you lose in court. Altshuler was a real craftsman, and Jack Wofford was an incredible lawyer. And the Altshuler plan was rooted in the past discrimination against minority workers in the construction trades as the reason that there was a need to do affirmative action to correct the past injustice. It was done very well. Again, it was cited by the Supreme Court on some decisions that went the wrong way. The Boston example designed by Altshuler was cited as the right way to deal with the problem. So what came out of the BTPR was really quite incredible. The Central Transportation Planning staff is the descendant of the Boston Transportation Planning Review, because there had never been this kind of openness in the planning process. And when it was over, which is the wrong term, when it concluded with the decision to not do the highways and primarily do these transit initiatives instead, a lot of us said, this process is really special. We've got to do something to keep it going. Oh my goodness. For some reason,
We got you. You're back. Nope,
I'm
you're,
back,
you're all
okay.
set. We can see you.
Yeah, I was plugged in and this thing came out. It's back in. Thank you. So a lot of us said this planning process has been better than everything we've ever seen before. We've got to figure out how to keep it going. And it was really Jack Wofford who did most of the work. I participated a little bit, Alan Altshuler, who again was brilliant on this stuff. And the Central Transportation Planning staff was created as a way of keeping that spirit of planning alive. And in the early days of the Central Transportation Planning staff, there was a significant urban design component to it and a lot of community participation and outreach being done out of the CTPS. Oh, this is telling me I'm muted. Can you hear me?
No, that was me. Sorry, that was my computer telling me.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Disregard.
So the initial CTPS tried to continue and did continue a lot of what was special about the BTPR. You know, in later years, when Ed King was governor, he did a frontal lobotomy on the MBTA, on the CTPS. They fired, on Christmas Eve, they fired 25 people. One of them, Bob Sloan, who unfortunately recently died. Some of you know Bob, a great human being. Bob had his first heart attack when those bastards fired him on Christmas Eve. It was just outrageous. Anybody who was doing community outreach, anybody who was doing transit, anybody who was doing anything that the highway department didn't like were on a hit list. The shock of cutting those elements out of the CTPS did a lot of damage. The CTPS retained a lot of professionalism on the techniques of planning, but being the main thrust of citizen participation, which is what it was continuing to do in the early 70s through 1978, that role got cut out of it, and it ended up getting built into individual contracts, so that typically a contract to do the Green Line extension would include some community participation in the budget, but the specialization and the expertise that was, the idea of the CTPS was to build up expertise continually, so we get better and better. It was a great institution, as Jack Wofford primarily conceptualized it. So a lot of very important stuff happened.
And just one footnote to Bob Sloan is very well known with connection with Walk Boston, which he was steward of for many years too. So,
yeah, Bob was incredible. And in the early days, in the 70s, I became Secretary of Transportation when Mike Dukakis got elected in 1975. I had been in East Boston, then I was Kevin White's transportation person. Then I went with Mike Dukakis to the secretary's position. Bob was working at the CTPS, and he was doing the community outreach on the depression of the central artery. He was part of the, along with Kathy Stein Hudson, we're out working in Charlestown to explain what the plans were. We got the devil kicked out of us in Charlestown because our initial plan was quite horrendous. The community
Oh.
came in with a different plan that was much better. We
Oh.
said, do you mind if we copy your plan? They said, no, we were hoping you'd be interested. And they saved us from the whole idea
Oh my God.
of the I-90, it used to have the 95 number, but the Tobin Bridge,
Yep.
the way it goes under City Square
Mm-hmm.
and over by Sand and Gravel, loops around,
Mhm.
and then goes into Boston. That used to be all elevated, and it just
Mhm.
it massacred what had been City Square. The
Yep.
community plan, which the only credit I'll take is being smart enough to see something, a better idea than we had. The community
All
plan
right.
really made City Square a wonderful place that it hadn't been for 100 years, because City Square had initially been destroyed when they built the L, because there was a major elevated transit station with stairways all over the place that obliterated the park. And then the Tobin Bridge, the Mystic River Bridge, took another slice out of it. So it's all this jumble. But over the years, the Orange Line shifted to going out to Wellington. So that was removed, and the Tobin approaches were extra high because they had to go over the old, but extra high and extra ugly. And the community plan said, replace that with something that goes under, and we get it's wrong to say get a park back. We get a park for the first time in our lives that's really worthy of the name. So, and Bob was central to that process, and was fired for the great role that he played. I mean, he did have a heart attack. It was so unsettling to be picked on that way, but fortunately he survived. He went on to do great work, eventually at Block Boston. So anyway, I'm going on too long. That was
No, it's great.
a great formative period that I was privileged to be part of. To try to stick a little bit to the continuity, because it relates partly to where some of you live. I believed incorrectly when I became secretary that we had three major transit initiatives: the Orange Line relocation, the Red Line extension, and the Blue Line extension. I thought the Blue Line extension was the one that was guaranteed to happen. It was relatively simple, not very complicated. It had always enjoyed very strong support in Lynn. There was a mayoral election. The new mayor decided he didn't want the Blue Line. We had flown the corridor in a helicopter with the Washington official in charge of funding to show him how sensible it was to build that extension. It was ready to go, federal money and all. The newly elected mayor said, nobody's shoving a Blue Line down my throat, get out of here. And we lost the Blue Line, just one dumb press conference. And, here we are, the Blue Line still doesn't reach Lynn. So the one that I thought was the most likely to happen ended up getting not done. I was pretty confident that the Orange Line would happen because there was so much community involvement. Tony Pangaro was leading the effort, Ken Crookemeyer. There were all kinds of really good people who had been part of the grassroots efforts fighting the highway, who came into planning the replacement transit and parks and bicycle paths. I was reasonably confident that was going to happen. I was not sure at all about the Red Line because as soon as the inner belt was killed, the threat of the inner belt had kept Cambridge at the table. Once they knew the highway wasn't coming, Cambridge set into bickering about everything. And it was like, oh my God, this is never going to come together. The original alignment, original is the wrong term. I mean, people have been talking about extending the Red Line since the 1930s. But at the time of Altshuler, the concept was that the Red Line would go straight out to Alewife from Harvard Square, just one stop, Alewife. It would go under Garden Street. People on Garden Street didn't want the vibration. And the city of Somerville said, oh, wait a minute, we would like it. Why don't you come our way? So the whole alignment that goes under Mass Ave and puts a stop at Porter and the stop at Davis, that was all and after the BTPR adjustment that Somerville did a masterful job at lobbying for. And even when that alignment was chosen, there was not going to be any connection between commuter rail and the Red Line at Porter Square because those were different empires. Commuter rail was something that the Yankees and Republicans rode. Good Irishmen rode transit. We don't want any connection. And I looked at the map and I said, "You mean we're not going to connect? We're not going to connect these two public transportation things?" So we just added the stop to the commuter rail so you could make the transfer. But all of those changes that I think made the project much better. It was really Somerville that rescued the Red Line. It had been, the bickering would have gone on forever if the original plan had been stuck to. And then it got controversial out at Alewife because, and this, the inaccurate history of Alewife drives me crazy. What actually happened at Alewife is the town of Arlington government, the town government came in and said, "We think you should go beyond Alewife and put a stop at Arlington Center and a stop at Arlington Heights, and maybe someday get all the way to 128, but we want this thing to serve Arlington." I was reluctant to go along with it because I knew we had the money by transferring the funds that were not going to be used for the highways. We could cover the Red Line out to Alewife. I said to them, "Look, I'm not going to take money that's supposed to go into Jamaica Plain and Roxbury and give it to you because you're nice. That's not fair. People have participated in this. If you can come up," they came in bragging that Tip O'Neill was their congressman, they could get money. I said, "That's great. You get extra money, I'm happy. I like to build things, but we're not taking money out of Roxbury, Jamaica Plain to put it into Cambridge and Arlington." They said, "No problem." We got good support from Tip O'Neill. And then the Monsignor of the church in the center of Arlington Center, who I think can only be described as a racist, I refuse to remember his name, he gave sermons about how the Red Line was going to bring all these dock people from Cambridge out. They were going to rape your daughters, steal your television sets, and go back on the Red Line. It was just obscene what this nut did. But the issue became so hot that there was no way to build it. So we went back to, okay, it's got to stop at Alewife, which had been the plan that we came out of the BTBR with Altshuler. Whereupon North Cambridge activists said, "Oh, those snooty people in Arlington, they don't want the Red Line. We don't want the Red Lines. Screw you." And all of a sudden, this agreement that the highways, Route 2 had already been built very wide, that the wide highway stopped at Alewife and people could get onto the train and the highway was going to go no further. These banana heads wanted to renege on the deal and tell the suburbanites to go to hell. You can get away with that for a while. They might have come back and revived the highway right through the neighborhood. But so Cambridge was very difficult. And we had to, in order to survive, I had, having worked to use environmental law to stop highway projects, I'm a civil engineer, not a lawyer, but I had some understanding of how the law works and how it could be used to block things. So I intentionally insisted on the Red Line station design not having ramps to connect to Route 2, because the ramps would have displaced more than 5,000 square feet of wetlands, which would have made it vulnerable to a veto of the Conservation Commission in Arlington, and we would have lost the whole project. And the technical people working with me said, "You're crazy. You're building this big transit thing and you don't have these, you have these half-baked highway connections." I said, "We will at least get the transit and I'll take a half-baked connection rather than a perfect plan that's going to get blocked." So the funny little ramps that exist were designed to be less than 5,000 square feet of wetland displacing, and they worked fine to get in and out of the garage. It was kind of over-designed. The plan that would have taken more wetland was over-designed anyway. So I've never regretted kind of ducking that issue because it's the reason I think we finally got the red line built. But the positive, the engine of support was mostly Somerville. The city manager of Cambridge, Jim Sullivan at the time, also wanted the red line done and did a lot of work to try to bring together community support for it. But it was the most he could pull off was non-opposition. It was really Somerville that was the engine of getting that piece of it done. What do those experiences say about mega projects and large projects? One thing is, when you're working on these projects, we all live in the short term, and you subliminally, you assume that things are not going to change. You're approaching a project, there are a certain set of laws, there's a certain amount of funding available, there are certain ways to get more funding, there are certain attitudes within the community. Even post-Altshuler, when you start paying attention to communities, you can think it through in a static way about where people are now. But where people are now does not tell you where they will be in 10 years. And when a project takes so long to get moving, everything changes, potentially. So in Cambridge, we're extending the red line to Tip O'Neill, when he ran for state rep in the 1930s, promised he was going to get the red line out of Harvard Square and out to Alewife. He was able to keep the promise about 35 years later because of this incredible set of occurrences. But with that long-held desire to get the red line extended, Cambridge opposed the completion of the red line extension. I never would have guessed that was coming. So there's a need to recognize, if you can, and anticipate where changes might occur, and how do you build in processes to try to stay abreast of those things. The other lesson, it seems to me, out of this is the way that we build large projects makes them very vulnerable to this kind of change, because the standard process in Massachusetts still is, should not be, but still is, you do an environmental process, you consider some alternatives, what are the pluses, what are the minuses, what are the adverse impacts, what are the positive impacts. You go through a process, you make some set of decisions, you use consultants to do that technical work. And then once you get a final environmental impact statement, you get rid of those consultants. You've paid money for the education of those consultants in what this project is about. You are not then allowed to use those consultants with all the expertise they've developed. You're not allowed to use that expertise to do the engineering for the project. So you bring in another set of engineers. It takes you a year to procure, because the process is designed not to be fair to the public, but to be fair to the engineering companies. So there's inordinate processes to make sure everybody gets a shot at participating. That wastes at least a year, usually more. You finally get the designer on board. They don't fully understand what came out of that EIS. Eventually, that engineering work is done. They give that product to the public agency, the highway agency or the transit agency. And then that agency sets out to construct it, again, releasing those consultants. So you've educated two sets of engineers. You've gone through that process twice. You throw all that expertise away. And now you're supposed to build this from blueprints that are never adequately clear. And your inspection forces in the typical agency, you got a construction worker with a bad back. He's got a friend, he gets to be a construction inspector. He doesn't know anything about electricity. That's okay, he's a good guy. That's what you got to implement this. It's just bizarre, and you're wasting time every step of the way. Now, with a design build process, which is finally what we finally had with the Green Line extension, although very late in the process, what you, in a well-structured design build process, you use a set of consultants because you never have enough capacity in-house. Each of these big things are quite unique. You can't have a bunch of tunnel experts sitting around in a corner because every 50 years you're going to build a tunnel. You hire consultants to do these unusual things that only come up once in a while. You hire a group of consultants to do the environmental work. You get to the point of decision, then you go right into the procurement of a design build entity that will do the final engineering and the construction, but you retain that first set of consultants to oversee, to make sure that the second group that's attached to the design, make sure that they in fact stick to the agreements that were built into the environmental process. Too often what happens is all of these elaborate agreements made in the environmental process are simply forgotten and ignored by the designers. So you've gone through all this process hoping and believing that you're doing the right thing and listening to the public. That information's thrown away and it's often ignored once you get into construction. With design build, you retain that expertise. They oversee the design builder, and you've got people who are actually engineers making sure that the construction is physically robust in the manner that the design build documents required. So you get a much better chance of actually implementing what you promised the public during the environmental process, and you reduce dramatically the length of time between the conceptual planning and environmental process and actually building it. So you reduce this process whereby, the community changes. People don't spend their lives going to meetings just because the transportation department thinks that's good for their soul. Once the threat of the highway was gone in Cambridge, people started to go bowling up to the sewing circle instead of going to political meetings to fight the Interbelt. And by the time we got to Alewife, a whole new set of activists came out who hadn't been involved at all and had no investment in the prior commitments. So with a design build process properly constituted, in my view, you shorten the process, you significantly increase the ability to retain that knowledge, and you get it built sooner, and sooner in a world with construction cost inflation also means less expensive. So you get many benefits out of doing a proper design build, in my view. The MBTA still doesn't like design build. It's bizarre. There are lots of engineers who love detail. They want to insist on controlling every screw that goes into every, widget. That's just wasteful. But the T, it is very hard to get the T to do design build, and it was the fiasco that they got into when the Green Line extension costs ballooned by like $1 billion, not a rounding error, that they scraped it back and they went to a true design build. They had really competent people manage. They recruited people to manage it, and the project, I haven't been out to look at it, but I think it's coming out pretty well from what I hear. But we don't have much track record in Massachusetts of design build. It's a relative, it was pretty common practice in Europe and Latin America, but a new idea. It wasn't even thought of when we were doing the Red Line or the Orange Line or the Big Dig. Those were all done in the traditional way. And a lot of the problems that emerged in all three of those emerged because of would have been avoided by design build. The best of the traditional projects, I think, was really the Orange Line relocation, because there was so much continuity in the community insisting that the details be done as they had been specified in the environmental process. Because in the political process, when Ed King beat Mike Dukakis and Tony Pangaro was no longer the head of the Southwest Corridor Project, there was a moment when a lot of the Southwest Corridor Project, the Orange Line relocation, could have been undermined. But Ken Kruckemeyer stayed in there and the community hung in there. And most of the details on that project came out the right way. But that was as much because of the community and the process that Tony and Ken had developed with the community that led to that outcome.
Oh, Fred, I've got a comment on the Green Line just to reinforce what you said. And then I've got a question, not related to Somerville or the Green Line, but having followed the Green Line project all the way through, absolutely in the first effort to build it, it just got overblown and just went completely off the rails. And the second effort has been close to on budget and close to on time, in the middle of a pandemic. So even though things are much streamlined, nobody is complaining. People never really wanted palaces for stations. So I would completely agree with your characterization of the two phases of the Green Line. And of course, it took a long time to get it on track in the first place. But I also wanted to go back to asking a question that you referred to early. Do you think the Blue Line to Lynn is still a feasible or worthwhile thing to think about? I do, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure. It's gotten much more difficult to implement because after the mayor of Lynn said he didn't want it, the whole wetland out in Saugus was declared an area of critical environmental concern, which makes it much more difficult to build across. And you've got to build somewhere, you have to build a connection from the Blue Line over to the railroad embankment if you're going to get to Lynn. And getting that done is way more difficult than it would have been before. So I don't know if that's, on the one hand, it's harder to do. The second thing is that the whole idea of converting commuter rail to regional rail with much greater frequency, if the T can really deliver regional rail with good frequency out as far as Lynn, it may be close to rapid transit in frequency. So you've got a pretty good solution, possibly without a lot of impact on the wetland, and you've got a very difficult problem getting across the wetland. So it might be a lot harder to get the Blue Line done. What the Blue Line gets you that an upgraded commuter rail or regional rail does not get you is a connection to Logan Airport. And that's a good thing for Lynn. So there's still reason to seriously look at it and try to get it done. If I were the mayor of Lynn, I would want that looked at, but I would also want the regional rail, and maybe they deserve both. But it's a little trickier than it would have been if it had been done on time.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to have to leave at 6:15. I just want to let everybody know. So, Stefan or whoever else wants to jump in, please do. And appreciate all your time, Fred. There may be a couple more questions if you can hang out a little bit
Sure.
for those.
I think Jacob's up next. Jacob, do you want to read aloud the question you put in the chat? I'm not sure if that's the same as what you wanted to ask with the hand raised.
First, hang on one second. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Great. My headset broke in half the other day, so I'm just using my laptop microphone for now.
It's fine. No problem at all.
First, Mr. Salvucci, it's such an honor to have you here at this committee. Sorry, I was a few minutes late. I have a class at college that ends at about 4:20, so for the next little bit, I'm going to be late to rock meeting. I guess I have sort of two questions. The Shawmut Avenue subway one, I don't know. I don't think I'll actually ask that one. I think the question that I ask, a question that I ask a good number of folks is, if what would have been one piece of concrete, like one piece of physical infrastructure and one piece of organizational change that would have made your job as Secretary of Transportation easier? Or like what one piece of organizational change and one piece of concrete change would really help you out?
Well, on the organizational change, if Ronald Reagan hadn't been president of the United States, we'd have built the Press Central Artery about 8 years earlier. I don't know if you'll allow that possibility, but he was outrageous. They made up all kinds of stuff, and they abused. And this is more than an anecdote about Ronald Reagan. It's a cautionary tale about the environmental process. He abused the environmental process, something outrageous. What we then called the Artery Tunnel Project. We had completed a final environmental impact statement in 1983, and it didn't get approved until it was rewritten, and it finally got approved in 1991. So that's a lot of delay to add to the project without really any improvement. And it's not that Ronald Reagan cared about the environmental quality of Boston. He was trying to stop the project because he didn't want to see Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy have a lot of money coming into the region. We were entitled to the money. It was part of the Interstate Highway Program. The law was clear. We were entitled to 90% federal funding for it. They made things miserable. But aside from the political anecdote, the environmental process is very amenable to abuse. Going back to the Green Line, there was a controversy in the development of the Green Line with where a maintenance facility should go. And the MBTA had proposed a maintenance facility pretty much where the Washington Street station has now been built. And that's where Somerville wanted economic development. They didn't want a maintenance facility, and the community was against it. The mayor was against it. Jim Aloisi was secretary at the time. He walked the site with the lead engineer in the EIS, a nice guy. I'm blanking on his name now. And Jim said, there's got to be some other place in this huge industrial area that we can put this maintenance facility. They figured out where to put it, which is where it was now constructed. And someone who was trying to kill the project said, oh, you changed the project. We have to do a supplemental environmental impact report. This is total rubbish. The relocation of the maintenance facility was a response to an environmental concern raised by the community and the mayor, and they had found a win-win location. They added about 2 years to the timeline of developing the final EIR under state law because of that contrivance. It had nothing to do with protecting the environment. So there's some sloppy thinking. I'm generally pro-environment, but there's some sloppy thinking by some environmentalists that delay is always good. It's not true. Delay is not always good. Delay destroys the confidence of people. If you expect people to come out to meetings and participate, they're giving up part of their lives to go to these meetings. If you make it go on so long that the outcome has nothing to do with their input, you totally demoralize the willingness of people to participate, and that's the key to the project coming out well. So the abuse of the environmental process by people who are seeking delay. Now, why would people seek delay? Budget people are almost always the enemy, because from the narrow-minded perspective of the budget director, if you can postpone a big project so it comes after your term, it's someone else's headache to finance. It's the worst kind of skullduggery, but it's very common. It happened in the state level. I experienced it with administration and finance. It happens at the MBTA. You'll often find, in my view, the so-called fiscal austerity advocates. It's not fiscal austerity. Well, I don't know what fiscal austerity means. It wastes a lot of money because it postpones the project, which drives up the project cost and reduces its quality. Another thing to watch out for is there's something called value engineering. Value engineering, I think, should mean let's look at this some more to see if we can enhance the value. In the hands of the fiscal austerity people, value engineering means let's see if we can do it cheaper. Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Cheaper usually means not as good. So value engineering, I think, is distorted from what its true purpose should be, which is to apply best engineering practice to getting a better outcome. It's distorted into, well, can we shave a couple of nickels off of this? I think it's the wrong way to look at it. So there are some built-in biases, particularly in budget departments. The environmental agencies sometimes fall for this and think, though, delay is always okay. It's really not always okay. So I got some concerns there. I didn't give you a good example on the physical side. I didn't. I guess I can think of one I'm embarrassed about, but I don't know how it could come out differently. In the crossing of the Charles River, which was called Scheme Z and which became very controversial, the right way to cross the river, in my mind, was for the I-93 is underground, goes under Causeway Street, then it rises and uses the Zachem Bridge basically to get to the north side, and then you have the loop ramps if you're going to the Tobin Bridge. It has to go up to get over the river because the Orange Line subway is upstream of I-93 in downtown Boston, but it's downstream and then under the viaduct on the Charlestown side. So you couldn't go under the river because you'd have a traffic light, with the Orange Line. It just wouldn't work. So the main line had to go up and over. And the Tobin Bridge, I think, was the Zachem Bridge, I think, was a really good solution to that actually is quite beautiful in many ways. But the connector ramps to Leverett Circle, those should have gone under the river. They were upstream of the Orange Line. If they went under the river and went to Leverett Circle underground, all of that extra steel and concrete that kind of mangles the backside of the North Station destroys a lot of land value if you're interested in financial, but even more important, it's a piece of the Charles River that's very important. It's where the river goes to meet the ocean. That should be a really stunningly beautiful place, and it's overrun by the Leverett Connector Bridge is a pretty good looking bridge somewhere else, but not in the location that it is. Why that didn't happen is too long a story, but it relates to the amount of delay that Reagan imposed made that issue come up very late when I was about to leave the government. The new government was going to take over. I believed at the time, I still believe it's true, that if I failed to complete the process before I left, the whole project was going to unravel because it was very complicated. And I think I was right. If you notice what happened in the Weld administration, they kind of bounced it around for a while, and I think the thing well could have been lost. The solution that got built, the bridge is quite nice, but those curvy ramps that go under the North Station, it's been a while since I've read about it. There were at least 6 motorcycle drivers who've been killed by those curves. Those curves were not needed or appropriate if you had built it the better way. You'd have had all straight runs. So that's one section that I still have nightmares about, thinking, was there any other way to get to the better outcome? There was an outcome that was safer, much better urban design, but would have cost extra money. And it was right at the tail end when there was no time to get that extra money. I couldn't figure out how to make that come out right.
One more question, sort of dovetailing into your comments about the Reagan administration. Sort of a little sub-question. Is it true that the original project included a north-south rail link and that the Reagan administration's delays killed that part of the project?
It's true the original project included the north-south rail link. I can't blame that on Reagan. To the degree anybody's at fault, it might have been Ed King. When we lost the election in 1978 and Ed King took Mike Dukakis's place, King really didn't like anything about the Big Dig. He wanted a tunnel to the airport, but he wanted it to go through the middle of East Boston. He didn't like anything about what actually got built. And he was trying to stop the project, and in the delay caused by those 4 years, the International Place got built. The high building done by Don Shafaro that's close to the Boston Harbor Hotel. That building crowds the amount of space available. The idea of putting the north to south connector in the first run at depressing the central artery, it was going to be in the median. And when I got back into the government in 1983, there wasn't room to fit it anymore. In addition, part of the idea with the north to south rail connector was that we could get this important rail link funded mostly with interstate highway dollars at 90-10, because the incremental cost of the extra width for the tunnel was pretty small. But, and we were, in the period of time I'm talking about, we were at the height of our political power. We had Tip O'Neill, we had Joe Moakley, we had Silvio Conti in the House, we had Ted Kennedy, and for a while we had Ed Brooke, then we had Tsongas. We had really skillful and successful politicians who could help us get federal money. By the time we got back into the government, the physical space to fit the north to south rail in that location was no longer there. And the political strength to get it into the project with a national government that was going to do their damnedest, because in the religion of the people at Federal Highway Administration, putting highway dollars into transit was like a mortal sin. They already hated us in Massachusetts because we had stopped the inner belt. And the fact that we shifted the money into transit made us even more the devils. And now we were going to try to do it again. So we had lost physical space and we had lost political space to pull that off in 1983 when we got back into the government. The current thoughts about how to do the north to south rail connector are not in the median, but they're under the depressed central artery. I'm not sure that makes sense. I have a feeling we'd be better off doing it under a different basically under Congress Street and not being deep on, the central artery underground is pretty deep in the vicinity of the connectors to the Sumner Callahan Tunnel. So you're forcing this thing to be deeper than it wants to be. So the original idea was not going to be very deep. It was going to be in the median. So basically the physical space changed and the political space changed. It still is the case that the dead end quality of South Station is a big disadvantage. It reduces the capacity and more people want service, you know, the whole east-west rail inland route. If we're going to have more and more people from the west using the Worcester-Framingham line instead of their cars to come into Boston, we've got to figure out how to get more people in and out, and South Station constraint is a problem. The connection to North Station would help, but it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time. So it's a much more challenging problem now than it would not have been a cakewalk in 1975, but it did seem feasible. It got much tougher.
Carl, do you want to ask aloud the question that you put into the Zoom chat?
Sure. It was, are there lessons from the large projects that you talked about that you think aren't being learned from, or that we could learn from, for Alston I-90 project and West Station?
With Alston I-90 and West Station, I think that the idea of having midday layup in the same space is a mistake. With the shift towards regional rail, for those of you who are not familiar with the plan, MBTA Commuter Rail Division wants there to be a midday layup facility in the middle of the land that is freed up. A lot of money was spent to get CSX to move their freight terminal out to Worcester. Worcester wanted it. It was not providing any significant service to the economy of Boston. Moving that was an important change. Building back some of it to store trains in the middle of the day is physically awkward and also doesn't make any sense. If we're changing, the idea of midday layup is embedded in an idea that commuter rail brings people in the morning and out at night and isn't used in the middle of the day. So it's convenient to store the trains midday somewhere close to South Station. If we shift the mentality to go to regional rail, we want to run service all day. We don't want to pay money to park trains. We want to pay money to run trains so people get service. So if that change were made, it's less complicated to build. I think we get better service and very important community, I don't want to call them amenities, I would call them necessities. There's a buffer park that needs to take place on the southern boundary. I mean, I love rail, but it's not a nice neighbor. This is still big, noisy stuff. It creates a lot of vibration. So the right plan, and I'm hopeful it'll come out this way, would include a buffer park between all the transportation infrastructure in the South Austin community. And in that buffer park, somewhat like the Southwest Corridor, something called the People's Pike, a bicycle path that allows you to get from North Austin to South Austin to an Aganis Way connector and over to the Paul Dudley White. Those are really essential parts of the multimodal project, and they're constrained by this midday layup. It occupies space that's very, it seems like a lot of land, but there's a lot that's trying to happen. Getting that facility out of there frees it up to give us a better West Station and a better overall outcome. The other change that I think is badly needed, when the project got kicked off during the tail end of the administration of Governor Patrick. The Secretary of Transportation, Rich Davey, did not include replacing the Grand Junction Bridge over the Charles River. He did include West Station with a 2-track West Worcester Framingham service, plus a 2-track shuttle from West Station to Kendall and North Station. But that shuttle requires a physically sound Grand Junction Bridge over the river. You can see through the Grand Junction Bridge if you walk out and look at it. You see the Charles River. It's all rusted out. They patched half of it, so they're running a half-baked single track on the patched half. The half that did not get patched is just a disaster. That's got to be replaced. It's 90 years old, and Davey took the position that of course it's got to be replaced. It was 80 years old at the time, but I don't want to make this project too complicated, so we'll do that separately. It'll be into construction at the same time as the rest of the project. Well, it hasn't moved. So to me, that should be part of the project, and it should include bike and pedestrian connections attached to that bridge, probably as cantilevers, so that you could get from the Esplanade on the Cambridge side to the Esplanade on the Allston Boston side. Because a lot of people like to either as joggers run the circuit or go on a bike or go on a walk. And you can't do that very conveniently now when you can walk across the River Street Bridge, but it's miserable. It's a narrow sidewalk. You're ducking cars. It's just a mess. You can really, you can do a great link for rail because it means people coming in from the west have access not just to downtown Boston, but with a simple transfer, they can get to Kendall and to North Station. So it's a good transit connection, but also it allows you to put in these really good links for pedestrians and bicycles and enhance the Charles River Reservation, which is, a really precious asset. So I'm hoping it'll come out right, but the two key pieces to make it better than the current planning would have it is to integrate the replacement of the Grand Junction Bridge over the river and add the bike and pedestrian lanes to them, and to get rid of the midday layup so the whole thing fits better.
Thanks.
We've just passed 6:30. I'm wondering if, well, first of all, Fred, do you have another few minutes that you could spend with us? Maybe
Sure, I got a
another
few
10
more
or
minutes.
15. But then the question for everybody else is, for the committee members, does anyone object to spending another few minutes with Mr. Salvucci, or does anyone feel that we should invite him back for another round in the future and move on to the other agenda items? I'll take.
I'd love to spend 5 more minutes, 5-10 more minutes. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and maybe if we can speed through the subcommittee reports, make sure we wrap on time.
I'd be happy to postpone the subcommittee reports until next month, even, because it's so great to have Mr. Salvucci here. So unless anyone significantly objects, either they'll wave or speak up, then let's continue. I've got one quick question for you, Mr. Salvucci. Back when the highway expansion. Oh, sorry. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Just real quick to wrap on that last conversation.
Please.
Carl, remind me in a subcommittee meeting that I really want to take up those points that were just raised as suggestions to improve the Allston I-90 West Station area. Those really resonated with me, and I think that ties kind of directly to our committee's work about helping to push suggestions or offer suggestions. So as much as I enjoy the historical, I love kind of getting a fresh perspective on a new area. So Carl, maybe you and I can take that offline and think about how discussing each of those 3 suggestions that were made for that area and figuring out how the ROC can kind of write a letter in support of any of those ideas.
Sure, thanks.
Craig, that's a great idea. Yeah, that would be excellent for the subcommittee. Fred, just this is a very quick thing. I think it might even be a yes or no thing. Back when before the highway expansions, Inner Belt, 95, Southwest Corridor were all canceled, was there any talk at the time of a similar kind of a mitigation via transit, the way that the big dig brought about the commuter rail parking expansion, the Green Line extension, the those transit mitigations? Was that something that had come up back in the 70s and 80s at all, or was it only for the big dig because that was so transformational and so impactful?
No, the ideas that were tied into the big dig in the so-called Conservation Law Foundation agreement that we made towards the end around 1990 were ideas that had been around for a while. They may have gone back to the VTPR. Some of them definitely did. The two physical ones were connecting the blue line to the red line, so that those are the only two transit lines that don't connect, and the extension of the green line. Now, it's really unfortunate. It's great that the green line's finally happening. It's unfortunate that it ends at Union Square. That really should connect to Porter Square, and then everything would connect together in a sensible way. And you got that damned electrical utility in the way, and fighting with that utility would have killed the whole project. But it's funny, environmentalists seem to be in love with electricity. The electric utility institutions are as bad as the worst transportation institutions we've ever seen. They're impossible to deal with, and reform of those institutions is badly needed. But there's a consequence in Union Square. Union Square, it's great that it's happening, but it's too bad that connection doesn't take place. Those two physical ideas have been around for a long time and were in the 10-year program for mass transportation of the MBTA. The idea of limiting the amount of parking at Logan Airport and in downtown Boston goes back to the clean air response crafted by Alan Altshuler and myself when I worked for the city in the 1973 period. But there was a requirement that transit fares go up by no greater than the increase in gasoline taxes or the rate of inflation, whichever was lower. We wanted to keep transit as a preferable way to get into the city, and we attached that to the big dig. Unfortunately, the State Department of Environmental Protection didn't enforce any of those agreements. They had insisted on the agreements. They're embedded in the vent shaft regulations of the big dig. And the MBTA walked away from them during the Weld administration, and the Department of Environmental Protection did nothing to insist on them. And that's why if it weren't for Mayor Curtatone fighting like a banshee, we never would have gotten the Green Line extension. And I'm hoping we'll finally get the blue to red. You were supposed to be able to ride on the blue to red connector in 2010. That's 12 years ago, and they haven't even started. So we tied these ideas, which had been around, independent of the central artery, we tied them into the central artery because that seemed like a good enforcement mechanism to get them done. And it should have been a good enforcement mechanism. And again, they're embedded in the vent shaft regulations that were just never enforced.
Wow, thank you. Anyone else? Questions? Hands raised, or just Jacob, please.
I guess you were just talking about this. It seems like half of your career was watching projects slip through your fingers like so much sand because of political wind changes. Do you have any advice for giving projects teeth or making them more durable and more resistant to temporary political alignment changes?
Yeah, the stronger the community base, when you're building the environmental impact statement, you got to conceptualize that as building the political base for the project at the same time, because that political base will be there longer than you. And that's what's going to the degree that the project becomes a success, it'll be because those citizens continue to fight for the dream project that they were involved in. So to the degree that, I mean, a lot of things have come out right on some of these projects, it's because of that community participation element. And the Southwest Corridor is, Orange Line is maybe the best example of that. That was largely built during the King administration. He hated all that stuff. He didn't care about it at all. But the strength of the community coalition kept it basically on track. And most of the key features survived a very adversary political climate. So I think that's the single best thing you can do.
Also, I've heard, this is not really as big or important question, but speaking of the Southwest Corridor of the Orange Line, I've heard references in a couple of documents to a proposal to, instead of building the Southwest Corridor in the trench, to build a Shawmut Avenue subway, which would have been closer to the elevated alignment. Do you know anything about, was this something that blasted into your administration?
No, that idea, there was a total consensus at the time that we're talking about, let's say 1970. There was a total consensus in the Black community and in the Jamaica Plain, somewhat Irish community. They hated the L. The L had been seen as a sign of discrimination since it was first built, and went next to the cathedral as an elevated facility making noise. They wanted that out of there. And they didn't like the noise, they didn't like the visual intrusion. And the belief at the time in the Black community was that not only would they rid what was then called the Dudley area, and now Nubian Square, of this blight, but it would create economic development opportunities in the corridor to redevelop the vacant land where the houses and jobs have been destroyed, and move that over, and move the service, the Orange Line, over to that corridor. There was then, very late in the BTPR process, a recognition that while the L was ugly and noisy, it did provide a lot of service. And what was going to take its place to provide service in Dudley, now Nubian, and in the South End? Three ideas emerged which were very inconsistent. One was to do a light rail on the median of Washington Street from somewhere in downtown out as far as Dudley, Nubian Square. Another was to build a subway all the way out to Grove Hall that would have a stop at Dudley, now Nubian, but continue out under Warren. And there was a third idea of putting an electric bus with the wires, the kind that still operates in Cambridge, on Washington Street, so that you'd have no diesel fumes. The electric buses are pretty quiet and pretty reliable, but that was seen as preferable. So there were these alternatives. There was no agreement. The city of Boston, the Roxbury community, the South End community were all lined up for different concepts. So that didn't get resolved until, in many ways, it's never been resolved. When the Orange Line opened to service, the replacement service was the 49 bus line, which had been a 30-minute frequency. It was upgraded to a 6-minute frequency, so it would be much more reasonable service, and with more bus stops, so it provided decent service to the community. But there were diesel buses. The electric buses had become controversial. The whole thing was, the least bad solution was to do, frequent buses. But they continued to talk about it, and the upgraded street furniture on Washington Street was finally implemented by general manager of the T. Bob Prince, who grew up in the neighborhood. And that's when they put in the fancy bus shelters that look nice, but don't keep the rain off you very well. But they do look nice. And it's funny because it's not just that they look nice. There were a lot of concerns about security, that a bus shelter that would protect you better from the rain would also inhibit the visibility and not be a safer place to wait. So that design, which is not good from a weather point of view, does have some advantages. That was all done under Bob Prince. And I think he did a good job given the lay of the land, but the subway was never a real option. It was kind of Chuck Turner had pushed it, and I think Chuck isn't here to defend himself. He passed away a couple of years ago, but I think his motivation was to ask for the most expensive thing he could imagine because he could always bargain down. But that kind of, now there's actually two other things. There's no new ideas somehow. It's the same physical geography. The possibility of creating something called bus rapid transit on Blue Hill Avenue, where the 28 bus goes, is quite active and alive in the city now and in the community. There's a lot of active planning going on that. And the Midland branch, which is a rail line fairly close by, we began upgrading that when I was still in the government because we saw that as a potential rail service that could get you much quicker service to the more distant parts of the community. I think there's a good chance over the years, various community advocacy efforts have resulted in adding 4 new stations to that line. So it has the potential to really act like a rapid transit line. And I think there's a decent chance of seeing it electrified and made much more frequent. So it becomes like a rapid transit line, but it's not in the subway. It's in the traditional open cut that's been there for about over a century. Current Secretary of Transportation, Jamie Tesler, has some very creative ideas about how to get Amtrak involved in helping to implement that. So in a sense, they're a descendant of Chuck Turner's idea of a subway further out into the community, way beyond Nubian. That survives in the idea of an electrified Fairmont branch and in the idea of an upgraded bus rapid transit line. I am quite sure that one or the other will happen. Maybe both of them will. So it's there to fight for another day, and there are people fighting for it.
I think we should move to conclude our time with Mr. Salvucci. Any final comments? Actually, Len, you haven't asked anything or made any comments. Would you like to? No problem, Len.
Sorry about that. So, no, I mean, actually, I had questions. I was more interested in listening though, and I didn't want to maybe go beyond the scope of the conversation. So yeah, no, this is great. This is really good. I guess a quick question, and maybe I should just go back and watch the recording of this, but just clarify quickly: did Cambridge stop the red line from going past Alewife? Is that what you said?
No. It
Okay.
was Alewife. It was Arlington.
Yeah, the
Arlington
racist
town
minister.
government. Yeah, the Arlington town
Right.
government demanded it, and then the Monsignor fought like hell against it and won.
Right. So what did
Arlington
Cambridge?
killed it.
So what did Cambridge say though about Alewife? You said the
So once,
Cambridge,
yeah, once Arlington said, we don't want the red line, then North Cambridge said, well, we don't want it either. It was kind of a town line fight. A lot of people in Cambridge felt that some of their neighbors had made a little more money and moved out to Arlington and were looking down their noses. So there was kind of a resentment thing. To me, they were biting off their nose to spite their face. Arlington Station, Alewife Station is a good thing. It protects the neighborhood from Route 2 blasting through and taking more housing. But it was a real perverse kind of dynamic. They did a very skillful job organizing. Unfortunately, from my point of view, they called themselves the Red Line Alert, and they really riled up a lot of community opposition in that neighborhood to the completion of the Alewife line. And there was a small group in East Arlington who I really respected. Their concern was that they were already getting flooding, and they were afraid if there was too much fill associated with the red line extension, the flooding in their basements would worsen, which is one of the other reasons I worked hard to restrict the amount of impact on the wetlands to below the 5,000 feet, so we could have the station without the flooding issue, which I thought was a legitimate concern. So there were funny little. East Cambridge had one concern. East Arlington had one concern. Central Arlington had this racist concern. They just didn't want the line out there. And North Cambridge had this kind of anti-snob reaction to Arlington, and they said they didn't want the line at all, which I had a problem with.
And the only other thing I was saying, it kind of reflects, harkens back to what you said earlier on about, you have these big projects, and by the time they're done, people have kind of moved on. And I feel that one of the issues that we have generally in planning, but particularly in transportation, is that we don't really try to guide where people go. Where we don't try to lead them to the place that we want them to be in terms of behavior. And so I was thinking about the Commission on the Future of Transportation. I thought that was a really good report that was done it was completed in 2019. It laid out I think 3 scenarios, and one I thought was very clear, and that was the one where you have regional centers of development. And I can see 5 of them, one in Lowell, one in Boston, of course, one Fall River, one Worcester, and one in Springfield. And these are big centers where you have lots of vibrancy, lots of public transportation, good development, business development there, and then you just connect them with high-speed rail. And so I often wonder why that commission has that report lost momentum, because we tried to carry the momentum for a couple of years and it's kind of died away. And so any thoughts about that report? It
was a great report. There are some people who have criticized Mayor Wu for pushing free bus. In the interest of accuracy, I supported Mayor Wu, so I'm not totally objective, perhaps. But my view is, there's an argument that says it would be more important to get better, more frequent bus service than free bus. That may be true theoretically, but I can get free bus. Just eliminate the fares and we can get that, and we'll get more ridership because it'll be good for people, and we can do it quickly and people will know that it happened. And upgrading bus takes a long, long time. The T has trouble hiring drivers. They have trouble with the equipment. They have trouble with the maintenance facilities. So in a sense, you have a choice between something you can do and something you probably can't do. So I think Mayor Wu has picked a good priority, and I think the free bus would do well. The analogy I'm making is the commuter rail fares have gotten way too high. The stereotype is that rich people ride commuter rail, so they make the prices so high that only rich people can afford to use commuter rail. those prices should come way down. Think about closer than the Lowells and the Lawrences. Waltham, for historical reasons, has a lot of blue collar and modest income population. It used to be a factory town. If the fare from the commuter rail station in Waltham Center were like a rapid transit fare, a lot of people would use it. Right now, they're on the 70 bus, which is a nice enough bus service that brings you into Central Square, but it takes forever. That's a long bus route. I like buses. I'm not against them, but you want the bus to serve the local need, and you got a really good rail line. If you lower those prices, people could use it, and it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. Make the prices too high, and only high-income people will use it. Make the prices affordable, you'll get a lot more people using it, and I think the high-income people will continue to use it too, because as you get more bodies on the train, you can justify the more frequent service that you want. So the theoretical choice, to go back to the bus analogy, that said, well, I'd rather have more frequent, better bus service than free buses. You'll never get more frequent, better bus service if you don't have the bodies on the buses to demonstrate that you need it. So to me, the free fare, that gets you something of use to people right away. It's doable. It'll build up the ridership, and that increased ridership will help drive the demand for the greater frequency that people really deserve. So that I agree with you. I like that report, but I think the fare strategy right now is in the way to implementing that concept. And I'm hopeful that with regional rail, we'll see there'll be a new governor, and maybe we'll see a revitalization of that idea. The funny thing is that Baker, it was his people that put that report together. It was a good report, but Baker didn't seem to have the stomach to deal with it.
Thank you. That was helpful. I appreciate it.
Let me make a quick check-in with Barry. In case, Barry, did you want to make any public comment? If so,
yes, as a matter of fact, I do.
Okay.
The old Boston Herald had a story in an editorial. It said that God says to Moses, "I have some good news for you and some bad news." Well, Lord, what is the good news? Well, I'm going to take the children of Israel out of Egypt to the land that I will show them, and Lord, what is the bad news? Oh, first I'm going to prepare an environmental impact statement.
That's very good, Barry.
That is good.
Barry, anything else? Otherwise, we can spend the rest of our time talking more with Mr. Salvucci.
That's it.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Barry. That was excellent. I'm going to defer to everybody else about how long we can go. I could go longer, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, including our guest.
Yeah, we've had our guest for a full 2 hours. I think that, I think you asked him to 6:15 and we're here all the way to 7. So I think we're probably at a natural breaking point here.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
I will go with that. Yeah.
I'm getting hungry too.
Fred, thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely an extraordinary session to hear from you and to be able to talk with you. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I'm happy to come back again at some point if you think that's useful.
Yes,
absolutely. We will take
absolutely.
you up on that. Yeah. But we'll also be respectful of your time and not make it too soon. So we don't want to waste your time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
I guess at this point, any really urgent business before we wrap? Otherwise, I can make a motion to
Let's say goodbye.
adjourn.
Briefly,
Good night. Thank you, Fred.
good night, Fred.
Right.
Bye, Mr. Salvucci. Thank you so much for joining us.
If you have any ideas for the UPWP, I sent out that survey. It's not really a survey; it's just really a request for ideas. I mean, I think the deadline is going to be around the middle of February. But aim for the first week of February, just so you don't miss it. And they do actually read the ideas and will try to develop something around it. I mean, let me rephrase that. Your idea is going to go into the universe, and so it will get consideration. And then, should enough people think that it is an idea to develop, people try to develop. You don't have to come up with a fully fleshed idea, but just something you think that would be worth studying.
Len,
Yes.
I've been locked out of the Twitter account for about a week because the password, it forgot the password somehow, and it needs
We can talk about that later.
Great. Okay.
sure.
Yeah. I'll call you or text you after the meeting.
Sure. All right. Thanks.
I guess I'll just ask any other last things. Otherwise, I will motion to adjourn. Can I have someone second?
Second.
Okay. Thank you all very much. This was excellent. Great to see everybody. See you at the next subcommittees, and see you a month from now.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Good night.